national movement pushing for equality and justice.
But the issues of racism in America span beyond policing. It's about systems and inequities that have been in place for years.
It's about housing, access to health care, education, and so much more.
KVUE's diving deep into Austin's racist roots, looking at the systems that stifle opportunities for blacks.
Because all lives can't matter until black lives do. This is a KVUE News special production, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Quita Culpepper.
And I'm Brian Mays. Welcome to part 2 of our KVUE News special, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Our goal during these special reports is to educate you about the barriers that stand between black Austinites and what the Constitution says is an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Last night we focused on policing and the long history of racial inequality in Austin. You can rewatch that now on our website, KVUE.com. Tonight we're continuing the conversation starting with housing inequality. We're familiar with Austin's affordability crisis, which impacts people of all races. But when factoring in the city's past housing policies related to race and the new ideas that fail to address systemic problems, it reveals barriers. Here's Ashley Godot.
It doesn't matter what side of town you're on, housing is an arena where race and class collide, and that's especially the case for black people in Austin.
The African-American experience in Austin is so overwhelmingly defined by a single neighborhood.
Urban political economist Elliot Trutter explores this in his book Shadows of a Sun Belt City, based on a report he wrote while teaching at the University of Texas.
We still see the ways that race played a very important role.
After the Civil War, freedmen communities, neighborhoods where former slaves lived, were sprinkled across Austin. But the city plan of 1928 created a Negro district, employing tactics like cutting off city services to force blacks out of the areas they called home onto the east side of town. But that action came after laws were passed by the Texas legislature.
State legislatures, primarily in the South, although not exclusively, we're very interested in using zoning, land use planning, as a way of creating or ensuring racial apartheid.
It was illegal, so the courts kept overturning Texas law. But in 1927, Texas passed a group of bills giving cities the power to create zoning and use that zoning to separate residents by race. At the same time, there was a rise in private zoning, allowing people to create their own rules about the use of land they were selling or developing.
This house can sell for this price. This house has to have this design. This house has to have this minimum requirement. This house, and uniformly, every single one says no person of African ancestry.
Even after the courts struck down these restrictions, the damage from city zoning was already done.
Those places became, the industrial zones. They became the places that were underdeveloped.
Over the years, changes in zoning and land development codes by city planners didn't make things better.
They're actually reinforcing those boundaries, reinforcing those differences through all the things that they're doing. And, from where schools get located to where flood remediation happens to where roads get built and all of these things.
Fast forward to Austin's boom, and gentrification creates new challenges for black residents.
Now it seems ever more pressing because the concern really is that you would push all of those groups way out of the city. And you've already seen this, the decline of African Americans as a percent of the population in the city's boundaries, things like that.
Understanding the history, Trutter says, is key to fixing the problem. And there are tools from land trust to legislative action. One tool, UT Black Studies professor Kevin Foster says, guardrails so people can't game affordable housing programs.
The property was designed for and intended for our firefighters, our teachers, our nurses, our nurse practitioners, our service workers, all these folks that are grinding it out and having to drive in from Maine or Del Valley. Like, that's what we were going for. But then what you have is graduate students who are broke, whose parents have plenty of money, who give them the one-time down payment and who back the young graduate student in attaining the loan to get the property.
Foster points out it's their right to use the programs, but it comes with societal consequences.
Don't complain. Don't complain when we have this huge affordability problem and when we have transportation gridlock and we have all of these other problems that cascade from our inability to fix these things.
Foster suggests a few sacrifices for some for the greater good of all, a concept that's not easy but could help build a better Austin.
Ahead, children left behind. The inequities young black children deal with while trying to get an education.
You're watching a
You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
For this segment, we've brought you out to Aikens High School in South Austin, named for Dr. William Aikens, the first African-American teacher to work at a high school in the desegregated Austin Independent School District back in 1964. For some students here and across the state of Texas, barriers stand between them and racial equality from an early age. KVUE's Marty Salazar shows us why not all educations are created equal.
Which groups are not benefiting from the system as it's currently designed? What policies and practices do we have in place that are continuing inequities?
One of the things that was an intense frustration in our community was the lack of objective data to be able to make better decisions about how to help students succeed and about how to identify and close equity gaps.
There are more than 5 million students in Texas, all of them with similar goals. Learn to succeed, but the road to success could be different depending on your family's income, your gender, or the color of your skin.
Data is just data unless you can use it to drive action.
Susan Dawson is the president of E3 Alliance, a data-driven education collaborative based in Austin. She says, according to their data, students from low-income families, especially Black and Hispanic boys, are neglected the most.
Some of it literally is just lack of access to resources, whether that's tutors or supports at home or opportunities during the summer to enhance learning. Some of it is actually bias in the system against students of color who face additional vulnerabilities and additional barriers when they're trying to succeed. Part of it is connectivity,
which has been a big discussion as thousands of students turn to digital learning throughout the coronavirus outbreak. It's one of the main reasons why the state is trying to reopen buildings this fall, at least for students that don't have technology or Wi-Fi. The E3 Alliance found there are 43,475 homes without connection in Travis County. Incomes above $150,000 per year are 80% connected. Incomes under $25,000 per year are 20% connected.
It's about calling people into their humanity.
Dr. Stephanie Hawley is Austin ISD's first Chief Equity Officer. She was hired in August 2019 during the school closures discussion when the Board of Trustees voted to close 4 schools serving mostly Black and brown students.
Most people think, racism or inequities comes from somebody being mean and using racial epithets. But that's not what it is. It is really about policies and practices that continue to produce the same outcomes for the same groups.
In Dr. Hawley's equity analysis on the East Austin school changes, she said closures would extend the district's more than 100-year history of racial and economic segregation and once again place the burden on the same communities in East Austin. The document says the school closures process began with an ongoing financial crisis, 8,000 empty seats, under-enrolled schools on the east side of the district, and overcrowding the west side of the district. Hawley says the only way to get rid of inequities in the school systems, interrogate policies and practices.
Because the system works for white middle class, English dominant students, but the system doesn't work for a lot of other students. And then you have to help people understand the difference between what we produce and what's the personal responsibility and accountability for changing. And that is extremely difficult.
One policy recently changed in AISD is the suspension of pre-K through 3rd grade kids. Hawley says that policy at one point was allowing isolation and detention of mostly Black and brown children.
That's an example of a policy, a clear policy that disrupts something that's harmful to children.
Recently, Austin ISD released their Equity Action Plan draft. In a list, they go into detail about different groups the district underserves in some capacity: Black, Asian, deaf, bilingual, and immigrant students, just to name a few. For Black and Hispanic students, the plan says they have lack of academic support for their success. It says they're overly placed in school suspension, and the district isn't supporting high outcomes. AISD wants the community to read it in the next couple of months and give input. What do they believe is missing? How can these issues get fixed? Dr. Hawley and Dawson say it will take a lot of uncomfortable conversations to fix these issues.
If you look at education outcomes in general, and specifically at equity in education, it is the civil rights issue of our day. It is the opportunity for students to have a chance to succeed in life, but only if we, as a community, are willing to change systems to allow all students to access that opportunity.
Mari Salazar, KVUE News.
One issue Madi touched on was that school disciplinary policies disproportionately affect children of color, and they can have long-lasting effects because of what's known as the school-to-prison pipeline.
I was racially bullied by multiple students over 30 times. They would call me the N-word. They would say I should go back to Africa.
What started with 12-year-old Temperance Darden being bullied ended with her getting expelled, sentenced to probation for 4 months, and having to deal with the juvenile justice system. Her mother filed multiple complaints with O. Henry Middle School in Austin. But the bullying didn't stop and led to what Darden said was her first in-school fight. Data from Texas Appleseed shows in 2015, black youth in Texas were referred to the juvenile probation system for school-related offenses at a rate almost 3 times higher than their white peers. Our partners at The Statesman found in Austin ISD's 2018-2019 school year, black students were suspended at nearly 5 times the rate of white students.
We have to change those policies and separate juvenile justice and school. School should be a safe place, but our student code of conduct, all of these policies need to look at how we mitigate harm.
Austin ISD sent us this statement saying in part, quote, leaders have implemented a variety of measures to eliminate disparities, including a 2017 policy to no longer suspend pre-K to second grade students and introduced restorative practices. Darden's mother pulled her out of AISD. Instead, she's enrolled in Texas Empowerment Academy, so she won't have to go to a juvenile detention center.
Ahead, unequal access to life-saving medicine and treatment. Why black Austinites have trouble getting the medical care that others may take for granted. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building.
Welcome back to a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
Now we're outside Central Health's headquarters on East Cesar Chavez in East Austin. This group has been working to make medical care accessible to everyone in Austin, focusing mainly on building clinics in eastern Travis County that are mostly populated by people of color. KVUE's Terry Gruca spoke with Dr. Carmen Valdez of Dell Medical School about what minority communities in Austin face when it comes to health care.
We see inequities both in the burden of illness, but also in terms of access to services at all levels of care. And so, when I say burden, what I'm referring to is that individuals from certain socioeconomic statuses or racial or ethnic backgrounds have higher rates of disease, higher rates of risk in their environment, and of certain conditions that can worsen their health or make them vulnerable to different health conditions. And we see that it's not only a matter of socioeconomic status. So, for example, we can easily understand how if you lived in poverty, you would have fewer access to resources, and you would also live in less stable environments. But we also see a racial effect in that even among educated and higher income groups, if you are Black or if you are Hispanic, you tend to still have elevated risk for birth fatalities, for example, or mortality, and for certain types like diabetes and maternal mortality itself. So there are groups that have a socioeconomic disadvantage and on top of that, a racial disadvantage towards health. And then because they tend to live in segregated environments, the institutions that are in their neighborhoods and their communities are institutions that are typically underfunded, under-resourced. And all of that over the life course contributes to poorer health outcomes and lower quality services and less likelihood of people having a stable medical home. We can diversify the workforce. The more we can then bring in people who come from those communities, who are already invested in serving those communities, and who possibly have lived some of those conditions themselves and can really understand how they shape patient health and their behavior.
Dr. Valdez, thanks for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can learn more on the disparities in healthcare here in Central Texas by heading to this story at KVUE.com.
One way to truly grasp the problem of health care for African Americans is to look at the maternal mortality rates. In Texas, Black women are at the greatest risk of dying during or after giving birth. They die more often than pregnant women in any other racial group, regardless of income, education, or other health factors. According to a 2018 report from the State Health Department, the pregnancy-related death rate is more than twice as high for Black women as it is for white women. Analysts found out of every 10,000 live births in Texas, 6 white women may die, but 14 Black women may. But 4 out of 5 pregnancy-related deaths in Texas were preventable because many were tied to heart disease, infections, or hemorrhages.
You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Welcome back to a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
Privilege to me means being able to take up space in a room or in a conversation and not feel like you shouldn't be there.
It's not something to fear. It is something to acknowledge and understand and use in order to make the world better. I have found that the best allies know how to use their privilege and their power to step up or step back in order to protect the most vulnerable person in the room.
Taking the burden of learning about racism off of the people of color around them. So that includes your friends, your coworkers, your acquaintances.
We could spend days, weeks, talking about what it'll take to achieve racial equality in the U.S. This issue won't be fixed overnight, but we hope these past 2 nights have helped spark a conversation and explain how, in so many ways, Austin's black residents aren't afforded the same opportunities for success as their white peers.
It's an uncomfortable issue for a lot of people to confront, so we want to thank you for being with us to explore these topics over the last 2 nights.
So you can go back and watch all of our special reports on our website, KVUE.com.
And we'll see you back here for our regular nightly newscast at 10 o'clock. Have a good night.
I was sick